On today's Lessons in Leadership, we have Sarah Smart, a serial non-executive director. Sarah, it's great to have you here with us today.
Thanks, Paul. It's great to be here.
Sarah, I ask everybody the same question when we do this first and foremost, and that's, can you just spend 2 or 3 minutes talking us through your career history and telling us a little bit about yourself and how you've got to where you are today for those viewers and listeners who might not know who you are?
Sure. So I started my career training as a chartered accountant up in Scotland, and I left the profession shortly after I qualified and moved into investment management for my what were called core executive career. I stayed there for about 10 years in a variety of different strategic roles. And actually went part-time in the last 2 or 3 years while I was in investment management. And during that time, when I was part-time, I started doing some pension trustee work and also non-exec trustee work for charities. That led me in 2008 to leaving full-time employment, leaving my proper job, as I call it, and actually starting my non-exec career then at the grand old age of 37. I took on from then a number of different non-exec and trustee positions, and I've been doing that for the last 13 years. So in that time, I've had a variety of different roles, ranging from chairing an organisation for 8.5 years in the pension space. I've been non-exec in sporting area, in public sector and in private sector. And I also chair audit committees for my sins, audit and risk committees. I tend to have a bit of a penchant for risk management as well. And at the moment, I am Senior Independent Director and Chair of the Audit Committee for the Pensions Regulator. I work with Unilever on their pension scheme in an investment capacity, and I also work with the Financial Times looking after the governance for their pension arrangements as well.
And Sarah, that's really interesting. And how did you find transitioning from an executive career to a non-executive career, especially at sort of the age of 37, which is relatively young to make that transition?
I mean, it wasn't easy to pick up roles, and so that was something that I did gradually over a number of years. I suppose I had a plan, a 5-year plan to transition from one part of my career to the next. So it gave me the time to be slightly choosy in terms of the roles that I wanted to do, and also to build up my credibility with certain people to enable me to get those roles. I think having clarity about the sort of things that I wanted to do, even though others thought I was were perhaps not understanding the path that I'd chosen, being very confident in myself as to why I was doing it helped. And also just help to overcome some of the resistance I felt from people because of my age. Certainly, it was not a traditional path that people had followed into non-executive work at that time, and so it did require quite a lot of resilience to keep going against some of the barriers I faced then.
And how did you go about overcoming some of those barriers?
I think just making sure that I was continually building my network, talking to people, having a support network who would encourage me, who knew my capabilities, who knew it wasn't personal if I wasn't getting followed up for some of the roles that I put myself forward for. And again, just having the end goal in mind. And making sure that I kept focused on that and kept going. It can sometimes feel a bit like a real sort of personal rejection when you're going for a job interview every other week sometimes. But you've just got to, I just kept reminding myself that it wasn't personal. The recruitment system does actually work most of the time, even if you think you're really well qualified for the role. If you're not selected, it's often because they're perhaps not ready for you, or it's just not a good fit for you and somewhere where you probably wouldn't enjoy. So I kept reminding myself of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've seen a trend in recent years to appoint younger non-exec directors, and obviously that's a big part of the diversity conversation as well, as boards look to bring diversity in there. What sort of hints and tips would you give to anybody who's thinking about building a non-executive portfolio career?
Ironically, I suppose I would say that because of the way the system still works, there's a certain amount of playing the game or ticking the boxes that people do expect to see in your CV in order to get those roles or to get your foot through the door. And so I think putting yourself in challenges throughout your career or roles that will enable people to easily see what your capabilities are can help. I think, if you move around a lot, then that is helpful for building up your experience. And I would definitely advocate that, but always make sure that you can make clear very quickly what experience you've got from that and what skills you've got from that, so that people can very quickly see how that will help what they're looking for and give them the capabilities that they're looking for. You've got to have a plan. I moved into doing non-exec roles, sort of thinking about them in 2008, and really started picking up roles in 2010. But I'd been planning since 2004 and using the time that when I was working part-times and the days off to pick up non-exec roles and trustee roles with charities, and it can take quite a long time to build up that capability to demonstrate to people.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you said there, and I think I've probably said many times before, when you're building a non-exec career, the first couple of appointments are the hardest to get, and that's often because nominations committees like to appoint people who've already got experience as a non-executive director, because during the first 12 months of being a non-executive director, people who've come to it from an executive career tend to get down and dirty in the detail a little bit too much, and they tend to try and replicate the executives' jobs. And a lot of the time, nominations committees don't want to be the ones that have to train a non-exec first and foremost. However, because boards are more focused now on diversity than they were even 10, 12 years ago, we are seeing a move away from that, and we are seeing a lot more first-time non-exec directors appointed by corporates.
Yeah, I mean, I really try and resist when I'm recruiting to rely on the fact, oh, someone's done this before, therefore they'll be good at it. It really doesn't follow. And I've sat on boards with a lot of people. I've sat with a lot of chairs who aren't very good chairs. And the fact that they've done it a lot of times before doesn't mean they're very good. So I do think recruitment is moving away from that a little bit, but I still think it's got quite a long way to go. And I think we all have a lot of thinking to do to put into that when we're trying to recruit for roles, to think, how do I really test whether someone has skills that I've got, rather than simply looking at whether they've done something like this before.
And I think that's a really fascinating point, and you've nailed something on the head there that I spoke about at a conference a couple of years ago, and managed to upset a number of the members in the audience, because somebody stood up and said he was getting turned down for non-executive director jobs because he didn't have the experience. However, he told me he had 20 years experience. And I responded, you haven't got 20 years experience, you've got 20 years of doing the same thing every year. So actually it's 1 year's experience times 20, which made me very unpopular at that conference. But actually it's a truism. If you've done the same thing over and over and over again, you're not accumulating more experience, you're just doing the same thing over and over again.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why, I mean, it's interesting, actually. One of the things that people ask is, what's the kind of most overused word about leadership capabilities that I don't necessarily agree with, and it would be experience. There's a difference between experience in something and just letting it wash over you and not learning from it, and being really open and self-aware to what's happening. In fact, not even the things you experience, but watching other people and how they deal with things and learning from each of those things. And I think really good non-execs have been through lots of different things, but they've thought deeply about all of them and learned from them and adjusted their approach as a result of that. And you can, there are really young people who've been through all sorts of different experiences and learned from all of those and applied it, who will offer great skills and things to your board, compared to people who, as you say, might have been through all sorts of things, but never necessarily taken the time to really learn from them, and they're not going to offer your board nearly as much quality skills.
One of the things I learned when I did an MBA course was about critical self-reflection. And actually, when I actually sat there and wrote an essay on this, I pointed out at the time, actually, it's very, very difficult in the business environment sometimes to self-critically reflect, because you don't have time to do it. You just move from one thing to the next. And actually, that's where the learning is. That's where you actually understand what you've done right, what you've done wrong, and how you can do things better next time. And unless you actually go through that process, you don't grow and you don't evolve. And actually, that, for me, that's one of the things we really look for when we're looking at non-exec directors. What's gone wrong, and how have you gone about correcting it, and what did you learn from that?
Yeah, I completely agree. But I would also say, if it's difficult to be critically self-aware or self-critical sometimes, there's usually plenty of other people who'll offer to do it for you if you ask them. So I think feedback, actively taking feedback from all sorts of different people at different levels of the organisation is a really critical thing to do. And I've certainly had times when I've received some feedback from someone and I thought, really? You're giving me feedback on that area? And I think potentially they're far weaker in that area than I am. But that is the perception that I am creating through my activity in that person, and that person's view of me is extremely valid if I'm going to be successful as a leader and as a non-exec. And so I think it also be self-critical, but also get other people to be critical of you, and then really reflect on what is creating that perception, what about your activity is creating that perception of others, and how you can behave differently next time to create a better perception if that's what you need to do.
Absolutely. I mean, early on in my career, if anybody gave me any criticism, it was my natural reaction to tell them why they were wrong, and to give them evidence as to why they were wrong. However, as I've kind of got older and a little bit wiser, actually, if I'm giving out that image, then obviously there is something wrong in the messaging, and therefore I've got to look at myself and understand how I can communicate the points that I want to make better.
Yeah, absolutely. And also thinking about the sort of things that behave, how other people behave, and how that makes you feel. I remember when I left one board, and until that point, everyone who'd left would had a dinner when they left, and a nice evening celebrating and that sort of thing. And because of how the timing of my leaving, we sort of finished our board meeting, had a few sandwiches, and off I went. And it was such a sort of letdown and dud, and I felt really underappreciated for the 6 years of hard work that I'd put into the board. And I just took the time to think, I never want to create that feeling in any of my board colleagues or board members who are leaving. And it was a really real learning point for me to make sure when people are going that you really take time to demonstrate how much that they've contributed and how appreciative you are.
Well, that's actually really interesting. One of the questions I jotted down today before speaking is how do you maintain compassionate leadership as a board member, and how do you convey that?
So I think making sure people feel appreciated, as I said, is really important, and particularly those who contribute perhaps in a different way than others contribute. There are, for me, a good board has louder people and quieter, more reflective people as well. And as the saying goes, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. And sometimes the people who speak loudest are felt to be contributing the most and being the most productive on a board, but that's not at all necessarily the case. Sometimes those reflective people and the people who speak least are actually contributing the most in some situations because they're highlighting the things that nobody else is. And I think it's really important to make sure all board members understand that their contribution is valid in those circumstances, and that they don't have to speak all of the time for you to understand the value that they are creating to the whole.
It's about the style of the individual as well. I sat on a board, and we had an individual on that board that very, very rarely spoke in the meetings, but would then follow up with very detailed analysis and feedback on some of the points that had been raised in the board meeting. And at first it used to drive me insane, because clearly you want the conversation whilst you're in the boardroom, but actually the points that the individual made were absolutely fantastic and straight to the crux of the problems that we were facing. And therefore, actually, it was worth having them in the room and waiting for their response, their written response afterwards.
Yes. So I agree, but I also agree with your point that if possible, to get that contribution in the board meeting is great. And some feedback I got from one of the quieter members of my boards when I was chairing the Pensions Trust was that she sometimes felt that the contributions she was making, weren't picked up on or a bit glossed over, which was really, really useful feedback for me, because I made sure then that when she was contributing, rather than letting the louder voices then come back in and sort of sweep onto the next point, just making sure there was a pause and saying, hang on, that's a very valid point. Let's spend a few minutes discussing that. What do other people think about that point? And having that discipline as a chair to make sure that space is made for those quieter people's points to be discussed, I think makes them feel much more included.
I guess changing tack a little bit now. Obviously, we're going through a global pandemic at the moment. COVID-19 has changed the way we operate and interact as a society as a whole, but for boards in particular. How have you kind of managed that process as a board member and as a chair to living in this virtual environment, and what have been some of the challenges along the way?
So for me, the most challenging thing is accessing the kind of informal feedback and informal conversations that you naturally get when you're on site in an organization, and bumping into people that you won't necessarily bump into in the boardroom. Everything has become very ironically, even though we're all at home, everything has become much more regimented. I mean, when did someone last just pick up the phone and phone you out of the blue? I haven't actually had a phone call for months. People are organizing Zooms and Teams meetings, but so it's much more regimented, and then it feels like, well, let's have a catch up rather than, and we'll organize to speak at 10 a.m. rather than we've just bumped into each other, let's have a coffee and a chat, even though we've got nothing to say. It feels like we have to have something to say when we have a Zoom catch up, which is more forced. And there are people who I would naturally just see in the organization who I'm not seeing anymore as a matter of course. And so that informal temperature of what's going on and understanding whether there are things beneath the surface that I need to be aware of is not happening for me at the moment, and that gives me some concern that there may be things bubbling up that I should be aware of that I'm not aware of, and that won't crop up until they become more problematic. The plus side, I would say, is that it has shown us that we can bring a much greater diversity into the workforce than we might have thought possible before. It's shown us that people don't need to be present in the office 9 to 5 in order to do an effective job. People can juggle childcare, other caring responsibilities, as well as doing a really good job. And I hope that learning about flexible workforces can survive beyond the pandemic.
I think you made two excellent points there, Sarah. And the first point around that informal contact is one of the things a number of the guests on this show have brought up. Phil Jones, who's the managing director of Brother, he mentioned it in our very first podcast. Stephen Rowe, who's the chief executive of Vision Super out in Australia, he mentioned it. Last week we had Martin Keeliger on the show, who's an entrepreneur and a VC investor, and he mentioned that same thing as well. He said, and they've all pretty much said that informal contact where you just get to see how somebody is, and you can tell if something's not quite right from their body language or whatever. You don't quite get that feedback, so it's a little bit harder to manage.
Yeah.
But equally, the other point you make there around the fact that you can have a different workforce working in different ways with diversity and building it around people's lives has shown that it can work as well. Now, it won't work in every circumstance, as has also been proven. But actually, it shows that a lot more can be done from home or via video and remotely than has ever been thought possible before. And some of the conversations we've had, I was speaking to the chief people officer of a major FTSE 100 a couple of weeks ago, and that individual was telling me, the real impact for them and what they've learned is really around their people and property strategy. So they don't need a great big HQ anymore. They still need a HQ, but it needs to be a much smaller HQ and a much more nimble HQ. And actually, they probably want more flexible working space around the country where they can get teams together to work when they need to, but don't have to keep huge offices.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. One of the things about remote working and all of us collaborating over video rather than in person is I do think it provides some thinking about how meeting structures and how best to structure your meetings to get everyone contributing in the way. We've talked about quieter members of the board and louder members of the board. I think that can be exacerbated in a virtual environment because it can be easier for people to feel reluctant to say something. It can be easier for people to hide, or it can be actually easier for people who might otherwise be quiet to speak up. So I think there's a different style of meeting logistics and governance required in a virtual world as well.
And away from work then, Sarah, how do you go about maintaining that work-life balance and what sort of keeps you going when the workloads are pretty tough?
I live in Scotland, but most of my work, physical work, if you like, is down south. And ironically, I felt the work-life balance easier when I was jetting backwards and forwards between Scotland and London, because it created a more natural break in terms of when I was working and when I had contemplative time. And that work-life balance, I think, for everyone has become much more challenging and difficult over COVID. I try to be quite regimented in terms of not working in the evenings unless particularly necessary, not working at the weekends. I did have to tell someone off a few months ago who had clearly been clearing out their inbox on a Friday afternoon, which meant that 10 emails arrived in my inbox at 5 o'clock on Friday with various things. I said, just ease off at lunchtime on Friday. Don't send it until Monday morning, otherwise I'll worry about it all weekend. So I try to be self-disciplined, both on that for myself, but also for other people, and not raising issues with people at the end of a week or late in the day. I think as a non-exec, you really miss out on the kind of social support network that you have when you're employed more full-time within an organisation. I still remember the last Christmas party that I went to with tears in my eyes, thinking next year it'll just be me with a streamer and a hat on my head on my own. But I mean, it sounds silly, but Christmas parties and things like that are such cohesive points in time for building your network within an organization, and you don't have those as a non-exec. And so it's really important to spend time building your support network with various other people that you know through different walks of life and in different roles and in different jobs, so that you can bounce ideas off people when you're in challenging times, bounce things off people, but know that you're in a trusted environment. They're not going to betray any confidences. The loss of the support network when you move out of a more formal employed environment was a bit of a sort of wake up call for me, and it takes time and energy to build that support network, but it really pays off when you're going through tough times to have that in place.
Okay. And how do you go about evaluating yourself as a leader?
Well, I think we talked before, making sure I'm getting feedback as much as possible from people as to what's working, what's not working. And I think ultimately setting yourself, I set myself objectives and targets and measure whether I'm achieving those, not only in terms of the goals that the organization has, but also in terms of, you know, whether it be coaching other members of the board, bringing on members of the executive to take on more challenges and things like that. I've always felt that it's important to have objectives for yourself as well that you can measure yourself against, to check that you're continually progressing and I'm continually learning. I hope that I never fall into the trap of thinking, you know, I know what I'm doing now, I can just carry on doing it. I see this as a constant learning process, and that I'm constantly learning things, setting myself new targets, having different objectives that I want to achieve. And as long as I'm getting feedback from other people, I'm remaining self-critical, I'm constantly striving to learn, then hopefully I will improve all the time.
I guess that leads us nicely into what you've done for leadership development. How have you gone about developing yourself? You know, have you done any sort of formal training on that as a non-executive, or have you done informal stuff? How have you gone about developing yourself?
I mean, when I first started as a non-exec, I saw, again, about having a plan. I saw that as a female, as an accountant, then audit committees would be a good route for me to move towards chairing committee roles and then board chairing. And so I've put myself forward to sit on audit committees and then to chair audit committees as a way of that progression. So a lot of non-exec stuff, a lot of non-exec training is learning by doing and putting yourself forward for those roles, so that you can continue to step up into different situations. So at the moment, obviously, sitting on the board of a regulator, I have made a real point of understanding how other regulators operate, not just financial regulators. I mean, I talk quite regularly to the chair of the risk committee of the FCA, and we swap notes and attend each other's meetings, so I can learn more about how that area of regulation works. But I also volunteered to do the tailored review a couple of years ago for the Health and Safety Executive on behalf of the DWP, Department of Work and Pensions, which involves basically a sort of big audit of whether the organisation is meeting its statutory objectives. And I've helped the Office for Nuclear Regulation recruit their non-execs. Now, I don't get paid for any of those things, but it gives me the opportunity to work with really interesting individuals and to see how different organisations work different, how regulation in a different sector works, and gives me lessons that I can then apply to my own organisation and thinking about my own organisation that are really, really valuable. So I really try and seek those extra experiences that will give me important lessons.
Throughout your career then, who would you say are the leaders you've admired the most, whether they be people you've worked with in your career or historical figures?
I mean, I'm not sure I'd immediately think of one single leader that I could point to. I think all leaders tend to be flawed as well in one way or another. I mean, if I think of someone like Winston Churchill, for example, his leadership during World War II, fantastic, phenomenal, and yet other periods of his life really not such a great leader at all. And I think many leaders can be particularly good when the circumstances really play to their strengths, but not necessarily good in other ways. And I suppose great leaders, of which there are a few, are able to adapt their style to the different sorts of situations that they are faced with if they're going to be a great leader in all sorts of different situations. There's one lady that I came across early on when I was on the board of UK Athletics, a lady called Baroness Sue Campbell, who chaired UK Sport and now does a lot of work with women's football and the FA, whose progression into executive and non-executive work, and obviously now in the House of Lords, was simply through playing netball and coaching netball when she was young. And I think for me, I mean, she was an amazing lady who really helped me with some challenges, governance challenges facing at the time, again, talking about building the support network. But it just shows you how great leaders can come from any walk of life, and might not necessarily be the people you would immediately think of as the stereotypical great leaders.
Oh, absolutely. I guess one final question today then, Sarah, would be, what advice would you give to other individuals looking to build a portfolio career?
Two key things, I think. Have a plan, have a long-term goal. It's difficult to do it quickly and overnight, particularly if your background is not the stereotypical background from moving from a chief exec role into another non-exec role. So have that long-term view, plan appropriately, have appropriate objectives, simple objectives at the beginning that you can build from, and remain resilient. Because there are an awful lot of organisations out there that need non-executive leadership, and it is very likely you will get turned down by a few of them on the way, but if you keep at it, you will be successful.
Okay. Sarah Smart, thank you very much for your time today. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you, Paul.